Okay, so that brings us to, well, back to evolution. Because now that we've got a feel for the organization of the living things, now we have to talk about how we organize all those living things into categories so that we understand how they relate to each other. So we're going to dive into that next. There are about 8.7 million living things that have been studied on Earth. And in order to study them well, we need to understand their relationships to each other. Trying to categorize them is complicated, and historically we've been limited in the ways that we could do that. We might have to look at where the organisms lived or how they reproduced, just general body shape, things like that. But today, we actually are able to do very refined looks at the relatedness between different organisms through DNA. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute here. But first, let's just talk about how we created these categories. So each large group gets broken down into smaller groups. And as you get smaller and smaller, the organisms become more and more similar until you break it all the way down to individual species of organisms. This original system, known as hierarchical taxonomy, it was proposed by a scientist named Carl Linnaeus back in the 18th century, 1700s. And Linnaeus played a really big part in how we think of and organize all living things. All right, here is an example of a taxonomic hierarchy for a dog. I'm going to grab my highlighter real quick. So you can see we've got most broadly, we've got eukaryotes, okay? And then that's going to break down into animalia, animals. And then chordata, chordates, we start in vertebrates and further and further and further until we get all the way down to where it's just dogs and wolf, and we've got canis lupus, right? So we can do this breakdown for all organisms that we've studied. Now, that being said, there are some that are still a little unclear that we're still trying to figure out exactly where they fit into everywhere. But for the most part, we've got a really nice clear picture, especially of these bigger groups, and especially for animals and eukaryotes in general. Sometimes things get a little bit fuzzy and confusing when we look at the archaea because of the distance, the evolutionary distance between groups of organisms. All right, so this is a cool image, just shows the different, call them domains, all right? Over on the far left, we've got a scanning electron microscope image of bacteria. So bacteria are part of the domain bacteria. They're prokaryotes. In the next one, we can see image of an extremophiles. Those are in the group archaea, also part of the prokaryotes. These are cool. These colored mats in hot springs. They can live in these just extreme temperatures, extreme acidity. It's really, really neat stuff. And then the last two images, we've got a sunflower and then we've got a lion. These are both part of the domain eukarya. Both eukaryotes, but very, very different, right? So back to Linnaeus. He's also the first to name organisms using this two unique name system that we call binomial naming system, genus, species. So binomial names, genus, the genus name is always going to be capitalized, and then the species name, which is always lowercase. Both words should always be set in italics. This is going to help if you're writing these out, it's going to let readers know, oh, this is a scientific name for an organism. And, sometimes they're not familiar to people. You have to look it up. So, for example, the North American blue jay is Cyanocida cristata, okay? You might not know that's a blue jay if you just heard it, right? Or us, Homo sapiens, right? Although I guess technically I think we're Homo sapiens now. There are two sapiens. Anyway. So we looked at the taxonomic hierarchy for dogs. Here it is for humans. Grab my little pointer again. So we are eukaryotes in the kingdom Animalia. The phylum is Chordata, chordates. That refers to our brain and spinal cord structure. We are Mammalia. We're mammals. We are in the order primate. Our family is the Hominidae. That's a fun word. Our genus is Homo, and our species is Sapien. All right, so you can see the full breakdown. All right. So those are looking at individual organisms, but maybe we want to look at all of the organisms and be able to make comparisons across them. So shown here, this is a phylogenetic tree. This tree was constructed by the microbiologist Carl Woese using genetic relationships. This is a big deal when this stuff came out, and the paper that this work came out in was just enormous. There were hundreds of scientists involved in getting all of this stuff put together. In fact, my doctoral advisor, back when he was a postdoc years ago when this was first happening, he's one of the authors on this paper, was part of that group. So what they did is they isolated DNA from thousands and thousands of different organisms, and they ran these special computer analyses to look at the relatedness. So based on their DNA, they picked specific genes. So they weren't looking at the entire genome, that kind of work. We can do it today, but when this was being done, they didn't even have a full human genome yet. They were still working on parts of it. So really just the amount of work that went into this is just spectacular. So what you can see in this tree is you can see the three major domains: the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukarya. And breaks out, you can see the relationships. Let me get my little highlighter again. So you can see, we have the bacteria quite different from the eukaryotes, but then along the line towards where eukaryotes evolved, you can see that archaea are more closely related to eukaryotes than bacteria are to eukaryotes, right? So these lines, the distance, the length of the lines, gives you information about the relatedness, about the timeline between how far evolved things are. And I know it's quite small, but like you can see like fungi and plants should be up there. You can see all these different groups. And really interesting to think about how related things are. Okay, so let's hop into the next thing, which is we're going to look at the different branches of biological study. So this is phylogenetics. That is a huge branch of biological study. But there are lots of other types of subdisciplines too. Molecular biology, which is, I played around in that space back in my undergrad days, looking at the processes at the molecular level, right? So the individual proteins, carbohydrate structures, that sort of stuff. Microbiology, that's what my bachelor's degree was in, is studying the structure and function of microorganisms. Oftentimes that focuses on just the prokaryotes, bacteria and archaea, but not exclusively. Microbiology also includes the study of protists, or sometimes we'll call that protistology. It just kind of depends on where you fall in the field. We also can have microbial physiologists, so it can get even more specific, or microbial ecologists, geneticists. It just, again, it kind of depends on where you're at and what your focus is on. On a grander scale, like neurobiology, so studying how the nervous system works, and that can focus on humans, or it might focus on other animals. Even jellyfish have a very primitive nervous system. And that can be at the molecular level, cellular level, developmental level. There's all these really different levels, including computational, where you're actually doing theoretical work, not working on the actual organisms. You likely wouldn't have him as an instructor, but my husband, the other Dr. Dye here at SGSC, he did computational chemistry, so studying theoretical chemistry. But there's computational biology too, really interesting fields. We can have paleontology, where we study life that is no longer alive. Extant is the term we use. So extinct things, life, the history of life. We can have zoology, which is studying animals and plants, any of the animal and plant groups. Very broad. Sometimes we'll toss fungi in there too, just for fun. Tends to be the more multicellular organisms fall into that space. But you can specialize in things like biotechnology, ecology, physiology of organisms or of humans. I mean, it's just so many different things you can specialize in. My doctoral level work was in cellular biology, so I studied how cells move. So that's actually its own little subcategory too, motility. But yeah, it's just kind of sky's the limit, honestly. And here we've got two examples. On the left is paleontologists, right? They're excavating a dinosaur. So archaeologists, paleontologists, they tend to go hand in hand. Some of these, there's kind of blurred lines depending on what your specialty is. And you can even have like paleobotanists, like Jurassic Park fans, like that's actually a thing, studying the plants that were present during those dinosaur eras. So there's kind of one side, and then the other side, I got this forensic scientist doing a DNA extraction. And he's working a pipette and doing the whole bit. That's how it works. Not quite the same as you see on like TV. It takes hours to do the extraction and then to do analysis, days, weeks, depending on what you're trying to do. All right, so that wraps up our very first section, themes and concepts of biology. Be sure that you look at your reading guide, make sure you've worked out the answers for that. Make a plan for when you're going to come back and watch 1.2, the process of science. You will need to get through both of these videos before you dig into working on like the retrieval questions in your packet. And then you still have your other stuff on Georgia View to do quizzes and such. So make sure you take a little break, plan when you're going to come back in, and I will see you in the next video.